Most people do not spend their birthday at a sports venue in a foreign country, cheering for athletes they have spent years quietly supporting behind the scenes. Most people do not receive their birthday wishes from a king. Most people do not carry the weight of a title that once belonged to their father, a man the whole world mourned, and simply get up the next morning and keep working. Prince Edward does. On the morning of March 10, 2026, while the rest of the British royal family gathered at Westminster Abbey for the Commonwealth Day service, the Duke of Edinburgh and his wife Sophie were somewhere entirely different. They were in Cortina d'Ampezzo, Italy, bundled up in winter gear, walking through the Paralympic village, meeting athletes, shaking hands, watching wheelchair curling and para cross-country skiing, and doing what they have quietly done for years, showing up where they said they would. Edward, who has served as patron of the British Paralympic Association since 2003, did not skip the event for his birthday. He made the event his birthday. That says everything you need to know about the kind of man he has become. He turned 62 that day. It is not a headline number the way 60 was, or 70 will be. But 62, when you look at the life that led to it, carries its own quiet significance. Because the story of Prince Edward is not a story of glamour or scandal or the kind of royal drama that fills newspaper front pages. It is a slower, more patient story. The story of a man who spent decades being quietly underestimated, who stumbled publicly, who lost his way for a season, who grieved, who rebuilt, and who eventually stepped into a version of himself that finally fit. Edward Anthony Richard Lewis was born at 8:20 in the evening on March 10, 1964, at Buckingham Palace. He was the fourth and youngest child of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. His was also something notable among his siblings, the only birth his father actually witnessed. Prince Philip, a man not known for softness, was present in the room when his youngest son arrived. It is a small detail, but it sits there, quiet and meaningful, at the very beginning of Edward's story. He came into a world that was already defined before he could speak. His older brother Charles was being groomed for the throne. His sister Anne was sharp and fearless and already earning her own reputation. His brother Andrew was the second son, the spare. Edward was the fourth. The youngest. The one who, in royal terms, mattered least to the succession and, therefore had the most room to breathe and, yet somehow also the most pressure to find his own reason to exist within the institution. Growing up at Buckingham Palace and at Windsor Castle, Edward's early education followed the royal blueprint. Governesses first, then Heatherdown Preparatory School in Berkshire, then Gordonstown, the famously demanding boarding school in Scotland that his father had attended and that Charles had famously suffered through. Edward made it through Gordonstown differently than his older brothers. He became head boy in his final term. It was not a small thing. The school was designed to strip boys down and build them back up through cold showers and outdoor challenges and relentless physical demands. Edward survived it well enough to lead it. After Gordonstown, he went to New Zealand for a year, working as a house tutor at Whanganui Collegiate School. It was a gap year that gave him something unusual for a young prince's ordinary life. He lived among people who were not thinking about royal succession or palace protocols. He was just a young man teaching and watching rugby and learning how different the world was outside the palace gates. That year planted something in him. A curiosity about regular life that would follow him home. He returned to England and enrolled at Jesus College, Cambridge, reading history. He graduated in 1986 with a Bachelor of Arts degree. His time at Cambridge was, by the accounts of those who knew him then, relatively ordinary. He was studious, he was social, and he was beginning to wonder what came next. For the elder royals, the path was clear. For Edward, it was not. And that uncertainty, that open question of who he was meant to be, would define the next decade of his life in complicated and often painful ways. After graduation came the decision that, in hindsight, set the tone for much of how the public would come to see him in those early years. He joined the Royal Marines as a university cadet. His father had served in the Navy. His brother Andrew had served in the Falklands and come home a war hero. The expectation was clear, even if it was never spoken out loud. Edward was expected to complete his Royal Marines training and take his place in the military tradition of the House of Windsor. He lasted 8 months. Then, he quit. The reaction was swift and unkind. The tabloids had a field day. Here was a prince of the realm, son of a naval officer, brother of a decorated soldier, and he had walked away from commando training because it was too hard. That was the story the press chose to tell. It was not entirely fair, and it was not entirely wrong. Edward himself said later that he had never felt the military was truly his calling. He was honest about it in a way that did not quite fit the expected royal mold of stoic endurance. And the public punished him for that honesty. What came next was unexpected. Instead of retreating into the palace and waiting for the criticism to blow over, Edward went into the theater. He reached out to Andrew Lloyd Webber, the legendary composer, and ended up working as a production assistant at the really useful theater company. He worked on The Phantom of the Opera. He worked on Cats and Starlight Express. He was not a prince sitting in a royal box watching other people work. He was in the rehearsal rooms, doing the actual work, learning the craft from the ground level. It was a remarkable choice. And it told a story about Edward that the tabloids were not particularly interested in telling at the time, that here was a young man genuinely passionate about the arts, willing to start at the bottom of an industry he loved, and committed to doing something real with his life outside of ceremony and ribbon cutting. In 1987, just a year into his time in the theater world, he organized a charity event that would haunt him for years. The Grand Knockout Tournament, broadcast on national television and quickly nicknamed It's a Royal Knockout, saw Edward alongside his siblings Zin and Andrew, competing in an elaborate outdoor game show for charity. The intentions were good. The execution was catastrophic. The British public found it undignified. The press found it embarrassing. Even the Queen, it was later reported, had not been enthusiastic about the event. When journalists pressed Edward after the broadcast and he got up and left the press conference without taking questions, the image of a sulky, thin-skinned prince stuck. He was not sulky. He was 23 years old, he had just watched a project he had poured genuine effort into get torn to pieces by the press, and he handled it badly. He was human. But, in 1987, the British tabloid press was not particularly interested in the nuance of a young royal's emotional management. They filed it away, and they would pull it out again and again over the coming years. Through all of it, Edward kept working. He left the really useful theater company in 1993 and formed his own television production company, Ardent Productions. He was interested in documentary work. He was interested in stories. He made programs and sold them to broadcasters, and for a while it seemed like he might actually carve out a legitimate career in the creative industries that had nothing to do with his last name. And then, in 1993, something happened that had nothing to do with television or theater or royal expectations. He met a woman named Sophie Rhys-Jones at a promotional shoot for a charity event. She was working in public relations. She was warm and grounded and completely unlike anyone he had met inside the palace walls. He was smitten immediately. She was not. Sophie was not looking for a prince. She was not particularly dazzled by titles or palaces. She was a working woman building a career, and the man in front of her was charming and clearly interested, but she was careful. They became friends first. Then, slowly, something more. It would take years before the relationship became public knowledge. Edward guarded it fiercely, writing personally to newspaper editors asking them to respect his privacy. For once, they largely did. What was building between Edward and Sophie, quietly and without fanfare, was the most stable thing in his life. And he knew it. In December 1998, on holiday in the Bahamas, he got down on one knee and proposed with an Asprey and Garrod ring featuring an oval diamond flanked by two heart-shaped stones set in white gold. She said yes. The engagement was announced on January 6, 1999. The wedding was set for June of the same year. The British public, perhaps weary of the royal marriages that had collapsed spectacularly through the 1990s, was cautiously hopeful. This felt different. It felt real. Edward was 34 years old, and he had finally found the thing that all his searching through the Marines, through the theater, through the television studios, through the gossip columns had been quietly leading him toward. He just did not know yet how completely that one decision would eventually transform everything else. The wedding took place on June 19, 1999, in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. It was deliberately smaller than the grand Westminster Abbey spectacles that had marked the marriages of Charles and Andrew before it, both of which had ended in divorce in full view of the world. Edward and Sophie chose something quieter. Something that felt, as much as anything involving a medieval chapel and the entire British royal family can feel, personal. On the day of the wedding, the Queen conferred on Edward the title Earl of Wessex. Sophie became the Countess of Wessex. They were not Duke and Duchess. They were not the highest-ranking couple in the room. They were simply, at last, married. And the watching public, battered by years of royal heartbreak, exhaled. In the early years of the marriage, things were genuinely complicated. Sophie was still running her public relations firm, and, in 2001, a tabloid reporter posing as a potential client recorded her making candid remarks about various politicians and public figures. The recording was published. It was embarrassing. It was exactly the kind of story the press had been waiting for, proof that the normal woman Edward had married was not quite as above the fray as she appeared. Sophie shut down the firm the following year. She stepped back from her business career entirely and became a full-time working member of the royal family. It was a significant sacrifice. She had spent years building something independent, something that was hers, and she gave it up without apparent bitterness. The decision earned her genuine respect from those watching closely. The same year Sophie wound down her business, Edward's own television company, Ardent Productions, found itself in serious trouble. A documentary crew from the company had been secretly filming inside the Sandringham estate without permission during a period when Prince William was a student at St. Andrews. The footage was invasive. The palace was furious. The story made headlines that were brutal in their specificity. Here was Edward, a prince, whose own production company had been caught pursuing the kind of intrusive royal footage that the family had been fighting against for years. The hypocrisy was impossible to ignore. Ardent Productions folded. Edward walked away from his television career and stepped, once and for all, into full-time royal duty. It was not the ending he would have chosen for that chapter of his life. He had spent 15 years trying to build something genuine in the creative industries. He had real passion for it. And it ended not with triumph but with embarrassment and a quiet retreat back behind the palace walls. But something shifted in him around that time. The failures, the Marines, the television company, the public mockery, stopped being things he was running from and started becoming things he had simply lived through. He was in his late 30s, married to a woman who understood him, and he was finally ready to build a life based on what he actually valued rather than what he was expected to value. The Duke of Edinburgh's award became the center of that rebuilt life. The award had been founded by his father, Prince Philip, in 1956. It was a youth development program designed to push young people between the ages of 14 and 24 through volunteering, skill building, physical challenges, and adventurous journeys. Edward had earned his own Gold Award in 1986. He understood from the inside what the program could do to a young person, how it could take someone uncertain of themselves and give them a framework for discovering what they were made of. He had been uncertain of himself for years. The award, in some ways, had always been his. As his father grew older and less able to maintain the full weight of his public schedule, Edward began quietly taking on more of the award's responsibilities. By the time he was in his 40s, it had become his primary purpose. He traveled internationally. He met young people in countries across the Commonwealth and beyond. He sat with them, listened to them, told them what completing his own Gold Award had meant to him. He was not performing warmth. He genuinely had it. The world was also watching something else during this period. Sophie's role within the royal family was growing in ways nobody had entirely predicted. She became known for her dedication to humanitarian causes, particularly her work on sexual violence in conflict zones. She visited the Democratic Republic of Congo in 2022 and, again in 2025, becoming the first member of the royal family to travel to that country for that purpose. She received the Hillary Rodham Clinton Award in 2022 for her work in this area. She was tireless and she was serious and she was, by every visible measure, one of the hardest working members of the royal family. Edward watched all of this and was quietly proud. He had chosen well. They had both chosen well. Their children grew up in Bagshot Park, a sprawling estate in Surrey, in a home that was unusual for a royal household in one important way. It felt, by all accounts, like an actual home. Sophie and Edward had made a deliberate choice early on not to give Louise and James the Prince and Princess titles they were entitled to under royal convention. They wanted their children to have as normal a childhood as possible. Louise went by Lady Louise. James went by James. They attended regular schools. They were not followed by protection officers in the invasive way that William and Harry had been. They had space to figure out who they were. Louise, born in November 2003 after a difficult delivery that involved a sudden placental abruption, grew up with a particularly close bond with her grandfather, Prince Philip. She inherited his love of carriage driving. When Philip died in April 2021, he left Louise his personal carriage and his driving ponies. The image of a young woman receiving her late grandfather's horses as a final gift is the kind of detail that does not need explanation. It carries its own meaning. Louise later enrolled at St. Andrews University and joined the Officers' Training Corps, quietly becoming, in some accounts, the first female royal since Queen Elizabeth II herself to pursue military service. James, born in December 2007, inherited his father's title Earl of Wessex when Edward was elevated to Duke of Edinburgh in 2023. He was 16 years old at the time. He has grown up in a family that moves between public duty and private life with more grace than most, and he is still becoming. The elevation to Duke of Edinburgh came on March 10, 2023, Edward's 59th birthday. King Charles, newly on the throne after the death of Queen Elizabeth in September 2022, conferred the dukedom on his youngest brother. The title had previously belonged to their father, Prince Philip, who had died in 2021. It had briefly passed to Charles upon his father's death, then merged with the crown when Charles became king. Giving it to Edward was both a gesture of brotherly affection and a statement of trust. It was also, for anyone paying attention, a kind of acknowledgement. Edward had earned it. Not through birth order or royal ceremony. Through 20-plus years of showing up. The months leading up to that 59th birthday had been among the hardest of Edward's life. In September 2022, Queen Elizabeth II died at Balmoral Castle at the age of 96. She had been the fixed point of every member of the royal family's existence. For Edward, the youngest, the one whose birth his father had witnessed, the one who had spent decades trying to live up to or away from or simply alongside her expectations, the loss was enormous. He did not speak publicly about his grief in the way that some expected him to. He did not give interviews about it. He appeared at the state funeral. He stood with his family. He walked behind the coffin. He was present, visibly affected, and completely private in the way that mattered. And then, he went back to work. In 2024, he served as Lord High Commissioner to the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, a prestigious role that put him at the centre of Scottish civic and religious life for several weeks. He did not treat it as a ceremonial obligation. He engaged with it. He travelled around Scotland. He listened to people. In 2025, he represented the King and the British government on multiple overseas tours. He went to Papua New Guinea for the 50-year anniversary of independence. He travelled to India, to Canada, to Japan with Sophie. He went to West Africa, spending 9 days in Nigeria and Ghana, meeting youth leaders and government officials, attending the international award events, planting trees, and sitting in classrooms in countries that would not normally appear on a working royal schedule unless someone genuinely cared about what happened there. He genuinely cared about what happened there. Back in London, the YouGov polling data from January 2026 told a story that would have seemed improbable to the tabloid writers of the 1990s who had catalogued his every stumble. Around half of all British adults held a positive opinion of Prince Edward. Only 19% held a negative one. For Sophie, the numbers were similar, and the negative rating was even lower. In a royal family facing genuine turbulence, with Harry and Meghan's estrangement still unresolved, with the king navigating his cancer recovery, with the shadow of his brother Andrew's arrest hanging over everything. Edward and Sophie were among the most trusted people in the institution. They had earned that trust the slow way. The only way it actually sticks. There is a photograph taken in 2024 by royal photographer Chris Jackson that shows Prince Edward in a way that almost no royal photograph ever does. He is sitting with his head bowed, his face scrunched up, his hands folded near his forehead. He is not performing composure. He is not holding himself together for the cameras. He is a man who has just heard something that has moved him deeply, and his body is doing the only thing it knows how to do with that feeling. The moment was captured during a visit to Leeds, just days before his 60th birthday. Sophie had just finished giving a speech about what their life together meant to her. Edward, sitting nearby, listened to his wife talk about him in a room full of people, and he came apart a little. Quietly. Privately, even though a camera was there. Jackson posted the photo on Edward's 62nd birthday with a note explaining what it showed, and why he had decided to share it. He called them two very important and hard-working members of the royal family. The internet agreed. That image, a man undone by his wife's kindness, tells the real story of who Prince Edward is at 62 more clearly than any official portrait, any list of patronages, any catalogue of overseas engagements. He is someone who married well and knows it. Someone who has not become too important to cry. The birthday itself unfolded in Cortina d'Ampezzo, the Italian mountain town hosting the 2026 Winter Paralympic Games. Edward and Sophie had traveled there not because it was on a list of required royal appearances, but because being present for the British Paralympic team was something Edward had committed to more than 2 decades earlier and had not stopped honoring since. He walked through the Paralympic village in official team merchandise, shaking hands, watching events, meeting the athletes and the staff and the supporters who make those games possible. Sophie wore a red Adidas puffer jacket and talked to competitors with the ease of someone who has been doing this long enough that the warmth is no longer practiced, it is simply who she is. Back in London, the palace was managing a different kind of atmosphere. The senior working royals, King Charles, Queen Camilla, Prince William, Kate Middleton, Princess Anne, had gathered at Westminster Abbey for the Commonwealth Day service. Edward and Sophie were absent, and Buckingham Palace had explained why clearly enough on social media. The Edinburghs were in Italy, cheering on the Paralympic team. It was a good reason. It was the right reason. Nobody within the family appeared to object to it. What nobody had quite prepared for was the choice of photograph. The Royal Collection Trust, which manages the historic image archive of the royal family, posted a birthday tribute to Edward on social media. The photograph they chose was a black and white image from 1969. In it, a young Edward, 5 years old, is playing with 2 of his siblings. The children in the photograph are Charles and Anne. The sibling absent from the photograph, conspicuously, in the specific context of that week, was Andrew. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor had been arrested on his 66th birthday, February 19, 2026, at the Sandringham estate on suspicion of misconduct in public office. The arrest had sent shockwaves through the palace and through the press. It came after months of escalating scrutiny related to his past associations, and it landed in the middle of a period when the monarchy was already navigating significant challenges. The choice to post a birthday tribute to Edward that included Charles and Anne, and not Andrew, was not accidental. Royal archivists do not make accidental choices in moments like that. The image was a statement. A clean, photographic statement about who was standing inside the institution and who was not. Outside Westminster Abbey on Commonwealth Day, there had been protesters. They were demanding answers about what the royal family had known about Andrew's various associations over the years. Inside, the service proceeded. The absence of Edward and Sophie, excused and explained, was simply part of the day's architecture. Their presence in Italy, doing their actual jobs, was perhaps the cleanest possible answer to the turbulence surrounding them. Edward turned 62 in one of the healthiest positions he has ever occupied within the institution, and that is not something he could have predicted 20 years ago or even 10. For most of his adult life, he was the royal family member whose name prompted a wince, not because of genuine scandal, but because of accumulated awkwardness. The failed Marine stint. The It's a Royal knockout embarrassment. The Ardent Productions collapse. The sense, maintained by tabloids for decades, that Edward could not quite get out of his own way. That story, told consistently enough over enough years, becomes the only story. And Edward had to live inside it for a long time. What changed was not a single dramatic moment. It was accumulated weight. It was years of showing up. It was the Duke of Edinburgh's award, taken to places across the world where nobody was watching. It was Sophie, who became not just his partner but, in many ways, the anchor of everything they do together publicly. It was Louise and James, raised with enough normalcy that they chose to keep their own names even when they could have taken more impressive ones. It was the death of his parents, first his father in 2021, then his mother in 2022, which stripped away the buffer between him and the full weight of who he now needed to be, and which he absorbed without falling apart in any visible or destructive way. It was the dukedom, received on his 59th birthday from a king who also happened to be his brother, carrying the name of a man both of them still miss. Prince Philip had been many things to many people. To Edward he had been, above everything else, the one person whose approval would have mattered most. Philip had not been an easy man to know. He was demanding and complex and famously private about his inner life. But he had been present at Edward's birth. He had watched all four of his children from whatever distance the era and the institution and the man himself allowed. And the award that bore his name, the program he had built in 1956 so that young people could discover what they were capable of, was now in Edward's hands. Edward carries it carefully. In 2025, the most recent full year of public engagements before his 62nd birthday, he and Sophie carried out the third and fourth highest number of engagements of any members of the royal family. They were behind only the very top tier of working royals. They traveled to countries that do not typically generate headlines in the British press. They met people whose names will never appear in royal profiles. They showed up to things quietly and left without drama. There is something almost radical about that, in the current media environment. The royal family occupies a strange cultural position in 2026, simultaneously more scrutinized and more fragile than it has been in decades, with questions about relevance and reform circling constantly, with family fractures still visible at the edges, with at least one member of the Windsor family currently under criminal investigation. In that landscape, a prince who simply does his work, loves his wife visibly and, without performance, raises children who use their actual names, and cries when his wife says something beautiful, that prince is, quietly, the most interesting one. The photograph from the Paralympic Village on March 10, 2026 shows Edward in a royal team jacket, standing in a crowd of athletes and support staff, looking entirely comfortable. Not performing comfort. Feeling it. He is in the right place, doing the right thing, on his birthday, because it is what he does. He is not the most powerful person in his family. He is not the most famous. He is not the center of any major story except, occasionally, as a note of stability in the margin of someone else's crisis. He has spent a long time learning how to be exactly where he is. At 62, the man who walked away from the Royal Marines, who made bad television, who was called weak and awkward and undignified and irrelevant across 3 separate decades of British tabloid journalism, that man is a duke. He is a councillor of state, legally empowered to act on behalf of the king. He is patron of the British Paralympic Association. He is chairman of the trustees of the Duke of Edinburgh's International Award Foundation, carrying forward his father's most lasting legacy. He is a husband who cried at his wife's words and let a camera see it. He is the father of a daughter who may become the first female royal to complete military service since Queen Elizabeth II herself, and a son still growing into whatever he will become. He is, by most measurements that actually matter, exactly who he was always trying to be. It just took 62 years to get there. And, on the day it became 62, he spent it in Italy, in the cold, in a crowd of Paralympic athletes, because that is what he had promised to do. The king sent a message. The family posted a photograph. The world noted the milestone briefly and moved on. Edward watched Great Britain compete. He stood next to Sophie. He was warm. He always is.